Hey there, everyone. My name is Eric Burketto. I am a software engineer and an open source intelligence investigative analyst. And today I am here to tell you about a paper within the LLM, large language model research space, that came out very recently, just about a month ago in early July of 2023, called A Survey on Evaluation of Large Language Models. My goal here for today is to walk you through some high-level key lessons and insights from that paper that are applicable for all evaluations of large language models across all use cases. And then to give you some of my own key takeaways, my top 4 key takeaways for how this paper and the findings from this paper apply to the work of trust and safety teams, including content moderation, open source intelligence and threat intelligence of bad actors and threat actors, and the overall protection of user safety and community health on user-generated content platforms. And then I will end here by telling you about how I think that I would use some of the information and key lessons from this paper in my own work as a trust and safety software engineer, as well as an open source intelligence data engineer and analyst. So let's get started and dive right into it. So this paper, A Survey on Evaluation of Large Language Models, from primary authors Yupeng Cheng and Shu Wang from Zhiyin University in China from last month, basically aims to be a comprehensive overview, the be-all, end-all catalog of how LLMs have been evaluated in different fields. And they put together this 3-dimensional categorization for work on the evaluation of large language models with 3 key dimensions as their axes. What you evaluate large language models on, which is the domains, the fields, the problems in which you want to see how they perform, how large language models perform. Where to evaluate LLMs on, which is the data sets that you use as your benchmarking for the tasks on which LLMs can perform, so you can get an assessment on how they perform, and how to evaluate LLMs in terms of 2 key subcategories, which is automatic evaluation using other AI systems for simplicity and objectiveness, like using other LLMs to grade the output from LLMs as one subcategory. And then the other is manual evaluations using, for example, crowdsourced ratings from like Mechanical Turk workers, or expert evaluative judgment from human domain experts, or whatever. Now, why do you want to evaluate LLMs? I mean, at a basic level, it's important because you need to have insight into the strengths and weaknesses of any given LLM for your use case and others. These things are powerful, and they have a lot of broad applicability across different domains. However, it is not uniform in their applicability across different domains. They perform differently in different domains, and they perform differently on different tasks within any given domain. And so it's important to gain clarity on how they will perform in the use case that you have in mind. Sure, at a basic level, you can always use certain basic technical metrics for performance evaluation, like, say, the perplexity score, which measures how well a given LLM predicts the sample, the next word in a sequence. The fundamental mechanism by which LLMs operate is based on the perplexity metric, which is actually coming from information theory and statistics. You could use that, but it doesn't give you any actionable insights into how an LLM is going to perform in, say, a medical domain context, in coaching, in counseling, in psychological evaluation, in mathematical analysis and mathematical research. whatever. Moreover, there is a lot of depth and a lot of breadth in the material that has been released about how to do LLM evaluation effectively. And so the authors of this paper basically propose that we should make evaluation, LLM evaluation, into its own new specialization, a specialized field within AI research, AI development, and AI systems writ large. This is especially important when it comes to mission critical areas in which it's very important to make sure that your AIs, your LLMs in this case, are reliable and trustworthy and are going to give safe output in, for example, a medical context where it may be a life or death matter for how the output is used by the LLM, and making sure that the output from it is right and correct and does not lead to casualties. That's important. That is why we need to be doing effective and thoughtful evaluation of LLMs for our systems, and why we need to be caring about how they perform in terms of their capabilities cognitively, as well as how safe they are and how ethical they are and how biased they are, how toxic they are. Now, as I mentioned to you near the beginning here, the authors intend this paper and the corresponding GitHub repository that is linked to in the abstract to be a comprehensive overview and catalog of all of the work that has been done on LLM evaluation in the field so far. A consequence of this is that they have done a pretty bang-up job at it, and the paper itself is quite sprawling, very extensive, and very detailed across a very wide range of different topics. This is a figure 1 from page 2 of the paper that lays out the structure that the authors have created for this paper in terms of each of the 3 dimensions that they laid out: what to evaluate, where to evaluate, and how to evaluate. We cannot cover everything that is in this tree, and to give you a closer look, if we take a look here at the zooming in on what to evaluate, we can see that it covers natural language processing in general, including natural language understanding, reasoning, natural language generation, multilingual NLP, and factuality, as well as an entire node for robustness, ethics, trustworthiness, and biases in LLMs. How they are applicable to social science questions, to natural science and engineering, including mathematics, general science, and engineering, to medical applications like medical queries and being medical assistants, how they can be used in agent applications, as well as several other more niche and miscellaneous applications like education and personality testing. As I mentioned to you before, we're not going to be covering all of these. We don't have time. Instead, I want to be telling you about some key insights that the paper contributed in doing this catalog of the entire field of evaluation, and then start deducing what the implications of some of these pieces of findings are for those of us working in trust and safety teams internally or on trust and safety related problems for the safer internet. Now, key takeaway number 1 out of 4. Let's get into it. The operational benefits and limitations of LLMs, which is what everybody is wanting to know about, right? Is, can they do well in your use case? Where do they do awesome, and where do they suck? And where do they struggle? So helpfully, the paper authors actually provide a summary, a high-level summary of what LLMs have as strengths and what they have as weaknesses at the end of their paper here. They articulates that in general, LLMs are very good at expressing language precisely, and they are very good with acting as stand-ins for other NLP models, particularly natural language understanding, like sentiment analysis and text classification. They can perform named entity recognition not just on named entities, but even on unnamed entities, as well as do things like extract links and relationships between entities, though they tend to struggle a little bit with events, which we'll get into in a little bit. They are solidly proficient at understanding context and comprehending the context of situations. Not infallible, but it is one of their strengths. So they can give you an output to any question that you ask that actually does some factoring in of the surrounding context of your situation. They also are very good across other natural language processing tasks, like machine translation, ideally and especially non-English to English languages, low resource to high resource languages like English, as opposed to the other way around, as well as text generation and question answering, including multi-turn question answering. But where do they struggle a little bit more? So here, we are going to dive into a little bit of these highlights, but at a high level. LLMs struggle with producing unbiased content. Their generation of content may include biases arising from their training data, as well as produce inaccuracies in their output from a factual perspective. The hallucination problem that has become so well known. This can lead to outputs that can be problematic. Okay. Beyond that, they are good with understanding certain basic logic, in particular causal logic and logic of relations, but other forms of and deductive reasoning. But other forms of logic and reasoning, they start to stumble. They get confused. They start making errors, whether that's qualitative reasoning or even basic, say, mathematical reasoning, like I was telling you about before, where they're good with arithmetic reasoning, but they tend to start struggling when it comes to division, irrational numbers, complex numbers, integrals, trigonometry, and the whole shebang. They can have limits with their memory, their long-term memory, when dealing with very large data sets. And so they can lose the tracking of context and performing tasks that involve very large amounts of text that overwhelm their context windows. They also are not very good at incorporating real-time information. They are relatively static. I mean, retraining models to be aware of real-time and up-to-date information is highly computationally expensive and monetarily expensive, which means that for rapidly dynamic situations and contexts, they can somewhat struggle. They are also sensitive to prompts. As a general rule, large language models are vulnerable to adversarial prompting. As a general rule, large language models as a class are vulnerable to adversarial prompts. They are not typically robust to prompts and adversarial prompt injections, which is a big deal and is the focus of several dedicated benchmarking datasets like Prompt Bench from Microsoft. They tend to struggle with certain dimensions of summarization of text, as well as the fact that they are not very good with counterfactual reasoning, which is what-if reasoning and hypothesis exploration. which is related to their overall limitations with complex reasoning. Now, let's talk about how this these strengths and weaknesses can manifest themselves in more commonly recognized day-to-day workflows, like software engineering and, say, content moderation teams and the like. So we have found, because LLMs are very good at natural language understanding and natural language generation, as well as causal logic and reasoning, they make pretty good writers of code in boilerplate context to automate the creation of startup code for getting up and running, and to help to debug errors in code that a programmer has already written. In those specific aspects, they are very good, and we all know that they have been used and are being used very frequently by software engineers for that use case. Some of us have also seen some chatter in different communities and parts about trying to automate the entire software engineering lifecycle using LLMs, being able to create complicated applications, web apps and the like, using just a zero-shot process with a large language model. Turns out that that is not actually viable right now. Because, yes, code generation in zero-shot is a strong suit for large language models right now. But they actually are not very good at common sense planning, okay? They might be able to do small planning tasks, but even things that humans consider basic and simple for project planning and task planning, LLMs don't do as well. They do not have well-developed ability to do generalized planning and generalization in general. So you can't make an LLM act as your Scrum Master on an agile development team, for example. And it also has certain other weaknesses when it comes to the full life cycle of code, such as the fact that they struggle with code vulnerability detection. And while they are very good with dynamic programming and greedy algorithms and search algorithms, they do not do nearly as well with data structure problems, working with trees, and working with graph theory and graph algorithms. So let's start talking here about factuality, ethics, and bias with LLMs. First, on factuality, it's really important to make sure that LLMs have as high levels of factuality, or at least as low levels of unfactuality as you can manage. That's not just important within a trust and safety context, although it is definitely a textbook case for trust and safety, with the spread of misinformation on platforms and in distribution channels that may have completely made up facts about people and places that could also lead to legal action, defamation, and everything associated with that. But even within other less socially networked domains like medicine or banking and finance, ensuring that the output of large language models is factual and reliable is important, because low factuality scores in output from LLMs has a lot of downstream effects. It can propagate throughout the rest of the application and system, which can lead to errant judgments and errant actions being taken in like financial analysis or day trading, right? Beyond just factuality, which we now evaluate primarily using the truthful QA dataset as the key benchmark used in the field. You also need to be concerned with the levels of bias in an LLM model that you are working with. Now, many of these LLMs have been found to still have bias in their output, even though the levels of bias has been heavily worked on from many embarrassing episodes in the past 5 to 6 years. Still, some biases continue to perpetuate within LLMs because of the biases that are embedded into their training data, generated and acquired from society with all of the social patterns that correspond to that. And LLMs have been found to generate bias in demographics, come on. The types of bias that LLMs can output that you can detect include demographic, cultural, linguistic, such as the bias in favor of high resource languages like English against low resource languages, temporal, and political and ideological. And moreover, that bias that is latent in any given large language model isn't just a static thing. It can, in fact, be amplified and shaped because it has been found by Deshband there that when you can use role-playing, you can introduce role-playing to the model, and by doing so, you can actually increase the frequency of toxic content generated by the model by a factor of 6 times. Okay? And somewhat interestingly, LLMs have actually been found in at least one study by Simmons, to exhibit biases in moral foundations theory. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with moral foundations theory, it is a theory of moral values that originally hails from moral psychology. It is based on 5 different axes of values that arise in pairs, okay? And those values are by the by, just as a very quick aside, I want to make a shout out to my old moral psychology college professor, Chuck Huff. Chuck, I never thought that I would be running into moral foundations theory and the moral reasoning and moral decision making as a way of evaluating AI models, but here we are, and it seems like you have taught me well. So, quickly, moral foundations theory is this theory that proposes that moral decision-making and moral reasoning by humans is done out of a set of 5 or sometimes 6 core foundational moral values that all people hold in different proportions along the axes of care and harm, fairness versus cheating. Fairness is also sometimes referred to as reciprocity. Loyalty, or in-group, with the flip side of being betrayal. Authority, also sometimes called respect, with the flip side of subversion. Sanctity, with the flip side of being degradation. And sometimes there's also a sixth dimension of liberty, with the flip side being oppression. And so the upshot of this is that research in moral psychology by Jonathan Haidt and others, including Chekhov, has found that people's political ideologies and dispositions actually correlate pretty closely with different combinations of moral values on the moral foundations theory, such with American political liberals tending to score highly in the care and harm and fairness and cheating dimensions. They care much more about care and compassion, preventing harm to others, and ensuring reciprocal fairness, whereas political conservatives have typically scored as around equal in all of the 5 moral foundation values. And what Simmons found here is that when he tested LLMs against questionnaires that measure the moral foundation's values, they actually exhibit, when primed to take on the persona of a political Democrat or a political Republican, he found that the large language model exhibits the same moral biases as someone of either of those ideologies. What this tells us is that LLMs at present are not yet, although they show some potential for doing ethical judgment and ethical evaluations of different situations for the most ethical and moral decision to take and course of action to take, they currently exhibit the same kind of rationalizations for choosing one or another different moral choice in a situation or scenario as humans do of different kind of political and ideological persuasions. Okay? Bias in your training data, as well as bias in the outputs from your model, can cause a host of pernicious and insidious problems within content moderation systems and general user interaction systems. You can have customers interacting with chatbots, customer service chatbots, and those chatbots can respond to the user in ways that are biased against their particular demographic, cultural, or geographic identities. In automated systems, you can have, if you have AI models that are performing decisions, making decisions as part of a content moderation workflow, as is often the case in most user-generated content moderation teams and AI content moderation systems to deal with the volume and scalability problems. The AIs are going to be your first line of defense, so to speak, for evaluating content that then gets ultimately passed to human reviewers if it is, say, appealed by the reporting users. And if you have models that exhibit social biases against or for a given group, that is reinforcing biases from that are already present in the training data, of the same kind of bias that has been written about by Cathy O'Neill in her book Weapons of Math Destruction with, say, predictive policing in predominantly Black communities, for example, that can exacerbate biased results and outcomes for members of certain communities. It can lead to over-moderation of some types of content and some communities, and under moderation of other pieces of content and other kinds of communities, including communities that might need to have their content moderated. Um, just as an example, I'm sorry, this can not just exacerbate problems within society writ large, but also problems that are already manifest in existing content moderation systems before even introducing a new large language model into the picture with the system. A key example of a real world case that would be impacted with something like this is, so in a paper published in the Journal of the ACM on Human-Computer Interaction in 2021, excellent queer technology researcher Oliver Hameson found that there are distinct differences in the content moderation experiences between conservative, transgender, and Black social media users, and in particular found that members of the Black and the trans community on social media face higher levels of removal of reporting of their content and removal of their content by the social media platforms, in spite of following the rules in higher rates and higher frequency for those platforms. In addition, we've seen that on several social media platforms, and particularly amongst queer communities, there is abuse of the reporting function, and in this case, the suicide and self-harm function, where you see a lot of queer and LGBTQ users who are being reported and actioned against for just talking about their lived experience and their gender identity. And like I said before, this is in a content moderation systems that are AI augmented using AI models that are not identical to ChatGPT and the GPT family of large language models, at least not yet. And so there is a significant risk of exacerbating existing biases and gray areas in existing content moderation, posing a significant challenge for how LLMs can be safely integrated into such workflows. You need to have accurate evaluation methods across a range of different axes and aspects of performance for large language models, including understanding of social knowledge and social context, recognition of psychosocial identity and mental health, and situational analysis. In order for LLMs to be effective decision makers in content moderation. And in order to make this safe and to reduce the risk of biased outputs that reduce the trust of your users in the model and in your platforms, it's important to acquire high quality data sets for your benchmarking and your evaluation, and to take a thoughtful and human expert-led approach to rooting out and cleaning biased data from your data sets before you go about doing your benchmarking evaluation of your large language models. That being said, it is worth noting that it is extremely difficult to remove all bias from large language models and their underlying training data. And in fact, you might not need to remove all bias from them. Emilio Ferreira, in this paper, he did not strictly attempt to measure different aspects and dimensions of social biases in large language models. His paper actually articulated that it is in principle possible to understand, leverage, and work around biases within LLMs. But in order to do so, it's important to follow several different principles. First, that it's important to be transparent with the biases of a particular LLM. It's also important to recognize the real world context that that bias comes out of. Then you can utilize that LLM in a way that is representative of the broader real world context and its broader societal biases. And while the LLMs that exhibit biased outputs may be still useful in certain contexts, it is nevertheless important to be responsible in how you leverage such biased models. You need to ensure that all stakeholders are informed of the fact of this LLM's or any given LLM's bias, and ensure that your decision making is adjusted and informed and influenced accordingly. There has been a lot of focus in the last several months on the problem of factuality from large language models. Everybody is concerned that large language models can hallucinate facts, that they do not have a strong enough grounding in real world facts. And in fact have such a disconnection and lack of reliance on real world facts that they make very good tools of automation for propagandists, for influence operations campaigns. This has been such a sensitive area and a point of concern and fear about large language models that even OpenAI itself released a report back in January of 2023 on their forecasting of the potential use of LLMs for influence operations campaigns and disinformation campaigns in an automated capacity. This particular risk of LLMs is probably one of the most well-known problems and risks for LLMs that is germane to those of us in the trust and safety profession. It has also been one of the most hashed out risks for LLMs, on which the most ink has been spilled about it. So I'm not going to spend much time focusing on the disinformation and influence operation campaign risk for LLMs. Instead, I want to focus attention on a few less obvious risk factors for LLMs. For example, we have covered that LLMs are very strong with their natural language inferencing, but they also come with bias still built in from their data sets. And that bias towards different entities and towards certain demographic, religious, cultural, other stereotypical or political or ideological groups can be magnified in its noxiousness and its frequency through the use of something like role-playing. Okay. We also know that LLMs have been found to exhibit above average EQ, emotional intelligence, and ability to assess the psychological and personality characteristics of a person through their text, as well as to personalize their output to that person based on their psychological profiling and personality assessment of such a person. What that means is that you have all of the components, all of the ingredients for an LLM to be useful for exacerbating social conflict between groups within society and inflaming already existing tensions in order to bring about a crisis. or exacerbate already existing crises, possibly leading to offline real-world violence. As a second example, all of the ingredients that I just listed previously, the above average EQ scores, where we can see here that in the testing from Wang, they found that GPT-4 scored at the 89th percentile in EQ. At 117 above 89% of human participants in basic EQ scores, in addition to its ability to do personalization and tailoring of content. If you combine that with certain prompting techniques such as persona modeling, you have all of the necessary ingredients for a chatbot that can be used to engage in deception of innocent users. And you can use these kind of chatbots to defraud users, okay? I mean, one trend that has been growing increasingly worrying over the last year and a half, which has the trust and safety community all abuzz, is the trend of pig butchering scams, which are essentially romance scams, but with an extra twist and flavor of cryptocurrency investments. For those interested, my friend Asaf Kipnis, formerly an I3 e-commerce fraud investigator at Meta, recently was interviewed for a podcast episode on the Trust in Tech podcast through the Integrity Institute, where he discussed the problem of pig butchering in great depth. He has also written excellent walkthroughs and detailed explanations documenting the journey that is taken by a victim of these pig butchering scams. Essentially, for the uninitiated, a pig butchering scam, actually, the name comes from the name for the technique by the scammers themselves, which originates out of China. Where it is likened to fattening up a pig over time through feeding it and cultivating and caring for it before you then go in for the kill. And in general, pig butchering scams involve creating and utilizing essentially kind of like honeypot accounts, typically on social media dating websites and professional networking sites, that all look too beautiful and attractive to quite be true. And they lure you in, start a relationship with you, move you off of the platforms onto a closed messaging application like WhatsApp. And then over time, through the use of video that is very clearly video and photos that are clearly not you, then as well as the use of emotional manipulation techniques, they build up a relationship with you and slowly undermine your own sense of self-worth and confidence and psychological trust. And then after kind of fattening you up and reducing your psychological defenses, they then convince you and pressure you using emotional guilting tactics to take advantage of an opportunity that they have to offer you to invest into a major cryptocurrency opportunity onto a separate cryptocurrency exchange, which the scammers actually secretly control. That leads to you depositing your funds into the account, although there are little small details that you can pick up on to indicate that this is an actual scam. And many people have been losing thousands or tens of thousands of dollars to this kind of scam operation. This is a prime example of social engineering. And this kind of social engineering is something that is within the realm of distinct possibility for LLMs, given that we already know about their EQ powers, their natural language understanding powers, their psychological and personality assessment powers, their ability to understand context, some of their ability to maintain long-term memory, which is kind of a work in progress on the technological and vector storefront, and so on and so forth. Imagine if you had chatbots that were able to perform this kind of sophisticated social engineering to defraud different victims. Okay, this could be scaled up on a massive scale. This is a major risk area for LLMs that needs to be taken into consideration when you are thinking about publishing an LLM, whether it has the capabilities to perform this kind of social engineering. Content warning. The following example includes mentions heavily of child sexual exploitation. Then there is the vulnerability of large language models continuingly to adversarial prompting that can break their robustness. Robustness covers and refers to a lot of different aspects of durableness and reliability of a system and a large language model. Not just its keeping in character to a persona that you have been given, but also its safety safeguards against the production of harmful material. And adversarial prompts that can cause LLMs to ignore their own trained safeguards against harmful material are a big deal. A key and very real example of what that can look like is in the realm of child sexual exploitation and CSAM, child sexual abuse material. CSAM material is an example of content that is flagrantly illegal to keep on user-generated content platforms. It is required by law to be taken down immediately and cannot be shared even among teams in its original form. And CSAM material can be comprised of a mix of different types of data. It can include not just images and video, but also text. And it can include the production of material that is offering a how-to guide for how to engage in predatory behavior against children and how to groom children. You can also end up with large language models that, if prompted in a sufficient adversarial way by bad actors who are providing it with specially crafted prompt strings, can end up being useful for the automated grooming of children. They can be used to personalize their content for 5, 6, 7-year-old kids in order to cultivate a relationship that ultimately ends in their sexual abuse and exploitation through the power of personalization and tailoring of content and persuasion by a language model. It's important to make sure that you are evaluating the safety of any LLM that your company is going to be releasing for all different dimensions of safety, including things like this with the robustness of the safety safeguards that are built into the model. That is something is deadly serious to your company's legal safety and continued legal existence as CSAM. So the takeaway there is use high-quality benchmarks like Trust GPT and others. Make sure that you are testing all different aspects of safety output for your LLM, and make sure that you are using benchmarks such as PromptBench to reduce the vulnerability of your LLMs to jailbreaking of its robustness from adversarial prompts as much as possible. Takeaway number 4, psychological aspects and personality traits. So this last takeaway is something that is a little less directly germane to trust and safety teams and problems, except insofar as it relates to interactions of users with your platform and with each other on your platform and on your communities. But one thing that I found particularly fascinating in this paper about how LLMs have been evaluated is on this section 3.7.3 about personality testing. Now, this is the bulk of this is about the testing of personality traits within LLMs themselves, which is an intriguing prospect. Now, to start, it is intriguing that ChatGPT, for example, has been found in at least 2 different experiments. ChatGPT was tested and assessed using the Myers-Briggs Typology Index assessment, and was found reliably in both of those assessment papers to test as an ENFJ. Although in the papers themselves, which specifically are referenced here by Hartman, by Runatowski. Hartman is another one about the political ideology. Rutanowski found that the score for ENFJ was relatively close to the median 50% mark between E and I, making ChatGPT kind of on the border between an ENFJ or an INFJ. In the online Myers-Briggs communities, that's typically referred to as an XNFJ, generally speaking. In addition, later papers have tested BARD and have found BARD, after it takes the MBTI assessment, to type as an ISTJ. And in addition to this, LLMs have been tested on 2 different occasions to reliably exhibit progressive political ideologies in terms of its voting preferences and its explanations and rationalizations for different political statements and political claims. This is meaningful and significant because personality, as we all know, makes up a pretty major part, not an entire part, but a pretty major part, has a major influence on the effectiveness of interpersonal communication between people. Different personalities are able to communicate with each other more effectively than others. And so knowing the personality traits of LLMs has implications for how they can communicate with their users. And as we covered earlier in this video, it is also true that LLMs, when prompted to take on one or another different political voting group, have been shown to exhibit the same moral biases in terms of the moral foundations theory and the moral values as actual humans who tend to identify with either of those groups. This particular phenomenon has been termed moral mimicry, as something that can be measured within LLMs. However, it turns out from other researchers' evaluations that there is a flaw here. These are actually 2 dots that can be connected when you read the original papers, but the authors Chang and Wang did not actually connect together in this particular paper. Which is that particularly it was found by Song this year that the LLMs, when you have them take self-assessment tests, it turns out that they can actually become somewhat fixated on giving answers of the same type or the same kind, regardless of the situational factors that are inserted into the questions, which is somewhat interesting because LLMs are supposed to be able to pick up on context and do accurate understanding of situations, right? But it turned out that they were giving the same type of answers regardless of whether the researchers changed the situation that was being asked about in the question. And it turned out that they found that LLMs do not exhibit a particular property necessary, specifically a form of order symmetry in their answers, to be able to accurately perform self-assessment and self-reflection. The reason why LLMs do that in Song's hypothesis is that if you compare self-assessments done by machines to how they are done by humans as a personality evaluation method of its own, humans, when they take a self-assessment, they introspect, they reflect on the given imagined situation, they project themselves into that situation. They imagine how they would think and how they would feel and react in that situation if they were in it. And then they take that vision of how they think that they would react, and then they project it into one of a set list of multiple choice options. And that, of course, requires the ability to introspect. LLMs don't do that. LLMs can't do self-reflection. All they do is react to input text. That means that personality assessments like MBTI in their current forms are not the appropriate and most, they are not reliable and trustworthy yardsticks against which we can measure any personality traits among an LLM. That does not mean that LLMs do not exhibit certain personality traits. They may indeed have personalities of their own, and evaluating them for personality is something that is meaningful and valuable to do. However, right now, MBTI and other and political compass and other self-assessment tests are not reliable and trustworthy for applying to LLMs. They're not the right tool. We need new tools in order to do this sort of thing. Ideally, personality tests and evaluations that don't ask the LLMs to do any introspecting and self-reflection, and instead just react to input, and then having the assessor evaluate personality traits based on the output text from the LLMs for a given input question, and potentially also evaluating whether all the same personality traits that we use for humans even make sense and are meaningful enough for machines. Maybe we don't really need to care about whether an LLM exhibits more of an introverted or an extroverted disposition, or a more conscientious or a more neurotic kind of disposition. Maybe we do need to worry more about something like, for example, its dominance trait against humans. That would be something that would be worth creating new personality inventories specific to machines. So now that we have covered the most important takeaways from this particular paper, I want to tell you guys about some of the ways that I am planning to use the information from this paper in my own workflows in trust and safety, as well as in open source intelligence investigations. Now, the first case that is the simplest and one of the ones that I am particularly excited about is multilingual investigations, especially with documents, okay? Because although it is doable, when you do not speak the language of the country or the section of the internet that you are investigating for a case or with the subject, you might be able to get away with relying on the automated machine translation capabilities that are built into some web browsers today, chief among them being Google Chrome and Microsoft Edge. However, that only works for content that is rendered in HTML, okay, or embedded in HTML. You cannot do that with files and documents. Chief among them being PDF documents. PDF documents are probably one of the most difficult cases for doing document scanning and extraction of information from documents. We have entire industries with optical character recognition to deal with this problem, whether it's going through contracts or scanning new resumes. So having large language models with the ability to take in and read files as document files and be able to perform machine translation at a high quality and summarize the information in those documents in your language is a really exciting use case that can save a lot of manual effort and time on the part of an investigator. And I actually want to show you guys an example of how this would work. Say, for example, that I am tasked with performing an assessment of the capabilities of a particular country's military industrial apparatus in a particular domain. That could be a nuclear weapons development domain, which can in fact be done partially from open source intelligence. Or in the case that I'm going to go into, the capabilities of a country in information warfare, such as that of Russia. And let's say that you are trying to perform that assessment in part using gray literature from that domain's internet. Gray literature includes all of the writing and media from the institutions that are in the public domain from that particular country. Journalism articles, nonprofit think tanks reports, public policy reports, academic research. So now let's say I'm interested in trying to assess Russia's capabilities and the state of their research into information warfare and disinformation, okay? And let's say specifically, I am trying to figure out what's the state of their academic research is into the psychological effects of disinformation and what their research directions that their field has in mind going forward. So I have this example, which is an article from the Journal of Social Psychology and Society, published out of Moscow. And this is an article from 2018, Disinformation in Social Networks, State and Prospects of Psychological Research. However, this document is entirely written in Russian, and I do not speak Russian, okay? There is no English translation, no English abstract, nothing that I would be able to look at and immediately parse what this document is about. Yes, I could try to do very manual machine translation using something like Google Translate, but my previous experience with that has found it to be a very time-intensive kind of workflow. So I want to get this thing fully translated and summarized, okay, to see what the key insights from this article might be. Now, let's use Anthropic's Claude LLM for this particular use case, since they have a larger context window than most other LLMs. So, and this can be potentially long documents that you are working with here. So let's attach the file. And we are going to paste in a ready prompt that I already have to summarize the document and output a table of research questions asked in it and its answers. Have that go. And here we are getting the summary that we wanted that would have taken a great deal of time to put together manually under less technically sophisticated workflows, including workflows that I myself have had to deal with in years past. This saves an immense amount of time. This is an out-of-the-box, ready-made application of LLMs to an OSINT investigator's workflow. And it utilizes LLM strengths, okay? It doesn't require the LLM to engage in complex multi-step reasoning. All it does is rely on its strengths in machine translation, including translating from non-English languages, including both high resource and low resource languages, into English. this works. This is something that I'm very excited about for my own investigations moving forward. Next, I'm really excited about the applications and the research that is currently developing for integrating LLMs with different APIs. Okay, the core of that research is trying to build agent applications, particularly agents that can talk to APIs for you to perform, for example, mathematical calculations using, for example, Wolfram Alpha. But there's a lot of application of integrating LLMs with APIs that are commonly used by OSINT analysts. Okay, and given how much data collection an OSINT analyst has to do on a day-to-day basis, including pulling data from APIs such as in years past the Twitter API, there's a lot of exciting applications for this. They can also, once you have the the LLMs set up to be able to talk to the APIs and use them effectively and be able to collect data from those APIs, there is a lot of potential for using these LLMs to perform a lot of natural language processing in the formal sense on the information that you have to deal with. Because as an OSINT investigator or analyst or a threat intelligence analyst, you have a lot of information coming at you in your information feed on a day-to-day basis, and you do not have time to be able to read through every single long document that shows up in your feed. And so you can use LLMs to extract entities of interest, you can label them, you can sort them, and you can organize all of this information from your long, lengthy documents into the information that is actionable intelligence for you, whether that's the current activities of individuals or organizations or weapons and equipment used or information sources or methodologies. And you can perform link analysis and link extraction to look at the relationships between each of these entities. This is a big deal, and we have already mentioned before, this is an area where LLMs are strong in terms of their reasoning about data in text. Another application that I'm especially excited about is using LLMs to bootstrap a pipeline for doing narrative analysis and social political community and group analysis. Because those particular methodologies, like narrative analysis, have been originally developed in the social sciences, including the computational social sciences, which is the subject of one of the sections in the current paper we are discussing today. And those have a lot of applications to some of the work that influence operations investigators and countering violent extremism experts have for their own analytical workflows day to day. Key examples here are the IO teams that have been looking at and observed the increasing prevalence of Nazification arguments that were being spread in Russian news journalists and Russian online ecosystems as part of the military buildup on the borders of Russia in the days leading up to their invasion of Ukraine, and their continued use of Nazification justifications for the continued invasion of Ukraine. Another is looking at the patterns and activities of the QAnon pseudo movement, which has a lot of applications to local domestic violent extremism prevention. And that engages in a lot of information warfare, okay? Lastly, I want to tell you guys about how I'm going to be using this or already using this in software engineering. So I have already been utilizing LLMs to help me to bootstrap new applications and take care of the generation of some of its boilerplate code, whether that is on data pipelines or NLP pipelines or creating new web API applications, or even taking code that I have obtained in one language with using OOP principles or a design pattern that I really like with the design of that code, but is written in a language such as Swift or maybe Scala, that I do not actually know, and needing to translate that into one of the languages that I do know as part of the applications I'm building, like TypeScript or JavaScript or Python or C#. I have been able to do that using LLMs as part of my workflow, and given that it utilizes strengths in software engineering for LLMs, for code generation, for translation from language to language, specifically for code, for the generation of boilerplate code. That's something that I'm excited to continue using as part of an augmentation of my software engineering workflows. I am also moving forward to looking to insert them into existing application architectures as certain bootstrapped or low barrier to entry natural language understanding components, to make those applications into full stack and LLM augmented apps for something like content moderation, for example, where you can essentially use in-context learning and specific combinations of prompts to have an LLM act as your few-shot classifier, as opposed to needing to put together an entire pipeline and an entire well-trained model for using machine learning engineering and topic analysis and the like for your specific use case. Lastly, I've already been using this in my my professional development and education and my improvement of my technical and engineering skills by leveraging the strengths that LLMs already have in summarization, as well as assistance in educational contexts, something which is in another section of the paper that I did not get into in a whole lot of detail so far, to help me to learn new techniques in software and NLP engineering, new methodologies, including reasoning and debugging methodologies, and new algorithms for software engineering, including something like practicing through lead code problems, where I have backed myself into a rabbit hole and am not getting a lot of traction on my particular approach. I can ask GPT-4 for a small hint, just enough to get me unblocked. And I have found that to be significantly advantageous and helpful for helping me to get better in my grinding of lead code problems, in my technical interviewing, in my understanding of advanced and intermediate data structures and algorithms, because of the rapidly accelerated feedback loops that you can get from using an LLM like this as part of your coaching and your professional development and education. So that is all that I have for everybody in this video. This is the formal reference to the paper on arXiv, as well as the link to the GitHub repository that is maintained by the authors. They update that repo in real time, adding on any and all new articles relevant to the evaluation of large language models that they come across, whereas they update the arXiv paper preprint in bursts, so to speak, since they cannot update it in real time. So that's all the content that I have for you all today. Let me know what you think of this. Let me know, because I am planning to produce more content of this nature focused on generative AI, large language models, and how to use them, not only within traditional software engineering, but also in less well-known domains, such as open source intelligence investigations, intelligence analysis, trust and safety, and user safety. And I am anxious to hear what everybody thinks and what your suggestions and your feedback is. So that's all that I have for you for today. I will hopefully see you all in the next video. Thanks.